Welcome to the Insurance Voice of South Texas. I'm Robert Crosby, the Executive Director of the Independent Agents of San Antonio. Today we'll be discussing some of the highlights of the 87th session of the Texas Legislature. Now I would like to introduce our guest speaker today, Lee Loftis, Chief Legislative Officer with the Independent Agents of Texas. He's a graduate of Texas Tech University. Lee has been an independent agent for 28 years prior to joining the Independent Agents of Texas. Lee is a dear friend of ours in San Antonio, and he is our voice in Austin. Now I would like to turn the program over to Lee.
Thank you, Robert. It's great to be with you today, and always great to be able to visit with my friends in San Antonio. And as Robert said, I have been with the association after a few years as an independent agent. I feel like I'm the luckiest person in the capital, having the backing of so many good members around the state. So thank you for that. Robert, let's talk about the 87th legislative session, because quite frankly, of the 8 sessions that I have been involved, this was by far the most strange session of all. If we all think back, January of this year, we were still in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and the session really started strangely. COVID testing was required prior to entering the Capitol. Quite frankly, most folks in my position and including the IIET lobby team, we did not go into the Capitol until about March. But the limited access, many of the offices were not accepting outside visitors. There were mask mandates, and so it was just a slow start to a very different session. One big change that occurred was there was a new speaker elected. This is our 3rd Speaker of the House in 3 sessions. So we had a lot of catching up to do with new committee members and new committees that we worked with. And speaking of committees, that was another thing, Robert, that was quite interesting, because the committee meetings were very limited. Only a certain number of people were allowed within the hearing rooms, and very limited testimony and all. So it just began very strange. So fast forward into the end of February, 1st of March, and it became much stranger. Winter Storm Uri hit the state of Texas, and from an insurance standpoint, it was a significant event. From a legislative standpoint, what it did is actually shifted the focus of many of the things that were going to be key items. It immediately shifted the focus to ERCOT and the Public Utilities Commission, the PUC here in Texas. There were immediate hearings about the stability of the grid, the electric grid, and the availability of providing power to Texans, and it became a very, very important task of the legislature. They are looking, the last notice I saw, Winter Storm Uri is looking to be roughly a $7.4 billion insured loss event. That's paid losses to date and reserves to date. So it was a significant event, Robert.
Absolutely, and I guess I have a question regarding that, of the amount of paid claims and estimated insured losses. How is the insurance industry going to recover from that? And so that's a question that I have. How is that going to affect us as independent agents?
Sure, and very good point. Obviously, the vast majority of the companies that independent agents represent will have a catastrophe reinsurance program in place. And so the short answer is a large amount of these insured losses will be covered under the reinsurance programs. But every company is different. They set their own limits and attachment points as to how much risk they retain versus how much they shift off to the reinsurers. Also, it's one of those deals, as you know, rates are prospective, not retrospective. We don't look back at losses and say, okay, because we had this many losses in the past or whatever, then that's what our future is. They look forward and try to determine losses based on what the predictions of future losses will be. So even though it's a substantial number, I mean, a $7.4 billion insured loss would be comparable to a hurricane down on the coast. And so it's a significant number. However, again, the vast majority of the carriers that we deal with will have some type of catastrophic reinsurance plan in place. So
very good.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the insurance legislation that was passed this session.
Sure. And you know, as we progressed, we got through the immediate issue with Winter Storm Uri, and then we're moving toward the end of the session, and the session really took another turn, and that was the Democratic House members walked out with 2 days remaining in the session over their dislike of the voter integrity bill. And it really kind of the session ended on a very sour note. And as all of us know, the governor immediately called a special session, and the House Democrats subsequently left and have been in Washington, D.C. for over a month now. And so from that standpoint, there's just more frustration going on right now than I ever remember in the House. And August the 7th, this Saturday, the governor announced and called a second special session with virtually the same issues on the table that were before. So we'll have to see how that plays out and all. Now, as far as legislation that got passed on a statewide basis, there were a lot of things that got done prior to the House shutting down. First and foremost is, as most of you know, the state of Texas is required to pass a balanced budget for a two-year biennium. They went into the legislative session, quite frankly, the legislature did, with a lot of concerns about the prior budget and a budget shortfall due to COVID and what it had done, but also because the oil and gas industry had taken a hit in the previous 2 years. The first estimate that I remember was probably June of 2020, about 6 months prior to the session. Controller Hager announced that he was looking at roughly a $14 billion shortfall in the previous biennium. And he made another prediction in, I believe, October, November, and it improved to about a $4 billion estimated shortfall. And quite frankly, the biennium looks like it's going to end with about a $3 billion surplus over the years. So as we got closer to the session and moved through that session and all, things have continued to improve. The opening of businesses helped substantially with the sales tax revenue that had been lacking previously. So all in all, the budget was an important piece that has to be passed each and every year, and they were able to do so. Another major issue, as I mentioned about the winter storm, is the power grid legislation to assure that if and when we have another event, whether it's a winter event or a heat wave that we're all accustomed to in Texas in the summer, that our power grid is available to sustain the usage necessary and all. So there was a lot of emphasis on that. And talking to my oil and gas friends, I think they know that there is going to be winterization and some requirements to make certain that the oil and gas industry that fires, especially the natural gas industry, that fires most of our plants in the grid are not compromised in the future because of a cold spell or a heat spell. So that was something that, again, took a lot of time and effort, but there was a lot of good legislation passed there. Another piece of legislation was strengthening the abortion requirements, what is called the heartbeat bill, that once a heartbeat is detected, that there is prohibition on an abortion. Now, that's one of those things, as we all know, anytime there is a piece of legislation regarding this, and we're going to expect litigation. And so that's one of the things. This is going to go through the courts, and it'll be some time before we determine whether or not this is held to be constitutional and allowed. So another issue that has some insurance implications, quite frankly, is the change in the constitutional carry laws here in the state of Texas. Previously, you were allowed to have open carry of firearms and have firearms in your vehicle and all if you had a license and it had gone through the training and all that. This legislation says that there is no longer any license requirement and no training. And so from a standpoint, I know right after it passed, I had a lot of questions and all what implications this might have with the insurance. If we see an uptick in shootings and all, then you get into the situation of, were you defending yourself, and is that covered under your personal liability, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one that like I say, has some long running insurance implications that we'll just have to wait and see how those come about. If you want to shift now, Robert, we can talk about some of the pieces of legislation that were insurance related.
Absolutely. Let's jump into that. And because you've answered the question regarding the big freeze and Winter Storm Uri. So let's talk about the insurance legislation.
Great. IAT went into this session, and we were working very closely with Texans for Lawsuit Reform, as well as the Texas Civil Justice League, on dealing with a couple of matters that were of great importance to the industry and to our members. And first and foremost was trucking litigation has skyrocketed in the state of Texas. All you have to do is turn on a television or pick up a newspaper and see the ads about, if you have been hit by or been involved in an accident with a tractor trailer rig or a truck, please contact our office. So it had just spiraled out of control, and we had to do something. So House Bill 19 is the product that came out of this legislative session. And I'll be honest, Robert, while it is not 100% of what we would have liked it to be in, there are pieces that still remain that we think will at least give the insurance companies and the accused party the ability to defend themselves. And don't want to get too deep in the woods, but the piece that was most important is what's called a bifurcated trial. And think of it this way: in a murder trial, first and foremost, you have a trial that determines guilt or innocence. Secondly is the sentencing piece. Well, in a tort case that's involving trucking litigation, first and foremost, now you will have a guilt and innocence phase, which basically places a percentage of blame on one or the other parties. Second, if there is a preponderance of the determination of the trucker being, the most at fault, then you go into a penalty phase or a judgment phase. The problem we've had in the past is you would have an accident and the plaintiff lawyer would say, don't deal with and don't listen to the specifics of this case. Look at all the bad things this trucking company has done over the last 30, 40 years. And they focus more on that piece than actually the facts of the case involved. So the bifurcation of the trial hopefully will eliminate a lot of these going forward, unless it is fairly certain that there is fault on the trucking company. So with that said, that is something, again, we'll have to wait and see how this pans out, but we're very pleased to have been able to get that passed.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, it was a big issue, and anytime tort reform is a issue, it's a big fight, but we feel good about the outcome. So
that's great.
Another piece is going into the session is pandemic liability protection, and our concern was that for businesses and of any kind, including insurance agents, if somebody came into your office and a week later they got sick, there was nothing that would prevent that person from filing a suit and saying, Robert, I came in and visited with you about my insurance last week, and then I got COVID, so I'm sure you gave it to me. Well, the pandemic liability protection protects businesses, medical providers, and manufacturers of medical equipment used in the pandemic, realm. Those people will have a liability protection if they can prove that they followed the guidelines of a governmental entity, whether it's the CDC, the state of Texas, the county, or the city. And so it's one of those things that our fear was not that there were a lot of cases that were being, brought out there, but our fear was there could be a substantial number of fraudulent cases, and just the cost to defend yourself in these could have been astronomical. So we're very pleased that the legislature worked through this and was able to get these in place. So those folks that can prove that they followed the guidelines and did the best they could on that should have liability protection and all. So
wow.
Yeah, it truly is. And again, we feel like it was a very necessary but very good piece of legislation that got passed. Another piece of legislation, House Bill 4030, deals with some agents licensing changes. There were a number of changes in there. This was in the Texas Department of Insurance biennial report as far as something they wanted to do to modernize some things. They got rid of some temporary licensing that had been put in place back when the department was way behind. I mean, it was taking anywhere from 60 to 90 days to get a license issued and all. So they had to put in some emergency licensing for temporary purposes to meet that. And House Bill 4030 eliminates that and some other licenses, an ISR, insurance service license. I believe the statistics, they said out of the hundreds of thousands of licenses that were issued, there were only 2,000 or 3,000 of those that were insurance service licenses. So it's a very, very small percentage. So what they have done on it is if you have an ISR, or insurance service license rather, what they will do is grandfather those that are in effect now, and they will on renewal actually just become a general property casualty license. Then in the future, there will no longer be the availability to get that that limited type license that we're talking about. So they did away with that. But probably the most important piece that affects agents is there was a terminology called a sub-agent that was in the statute in Texas. Before an agency itself would contract with the company, any licensed producer would then be a sub-agent under that license. That was an anomaly. There were only 3 states that had that arrangement. There are now only 2 states because House Bill 4030 eliminates the sub-agent classification. So each and every company will appoint direct appointment with each licensed individual within that agency. And it should, there was, we've had a lot of discussions with TDI over that, but the reality is companies should be going to the NIPR, which is the National License Database, or CertCon, and be able to get the information electronically and be able to get all that done and get all the licensing requirements taken care of under this. And like I say, this is something that companies are used to because we are one of only 3 states that had this sub-agent. So we're catching up to the rest of the country on that matter.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad to hear that. I really am.
Yeah.
The whole licensing issue. Absolutely.
It makes sense and should not be a problem. I will tell your listeners that if anybody runs into problems with requests from companies or whatever, please have them contact me and let me know, and we will have TDI contact that company. So,
super.
A couple of more commercial lines modernization, Senate Bill 1367. There are roughly 17 lines of business that are somewhat, could be surplus lines, could be admitted, but they're boiler and machinery and surety bonds and cybersecurity and all, that there are companies that are more than willing to make filings and all that, but it takes a long time to do a filing and for the Department of Insurance to review those filings and accept the new forms and all that. So what this did is it took those 17 lines of business, and basically there are no longer requirements for rate or form approval by TDI. So it's just an improvement that's going to bring more products to the marketplace faster for our members. So we were very supportive. Worked with the insurance industry, APCIA, American Property Casualty Insurance Association, very closely with them, and happy to get that passed. So I guess last, Robert, it wouldn't be right if I didn't have to speak a little bit about the Texas Windstorm Insurance Association, but I can tell you
for many years.
Exactly. Fortunately, the only significant TWIA bill passed this session was House Bill 769, and the biggest thing that occurred on that is it basically prohibits a vote on rate if there are any vacancies on the board of directors. Currently, there are no vacancies, and as a matter of fact, this past week there was a board meeting, and the board voted to increase rates 5% over the objection of a number of people. But anyway, TWIA continues to struggle with long-term viability on the funding. So there is an interim study that's going to be done, and IAT will be involved in that and participate in that to help find a better long-term strategy of funding for TWIA. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, what we got done this last session, Robert.
Well, it's been a crazy session. Now we're going to have a second session. Briefly, Lee, what do you see on the horizon? What's next in this crazy world we're living in right now?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, the Democratic House members will have to come back to Texas at some point in time And so if and when they do, then I would think that we will have a very short special session to get past the things the governor wants passed and all. One thing that we know is coming in September, October is redistricting. Every 10 years, redistricting is required, and they will redraw the Texas House member seats, the Texas Senate member seats, and the congressional, U.S. congressional seats. So we know that's going to be here in September and October. But other than that, Robert, we'll begin getting ready for the next regular session in 2023. And again, I urge any of your listeners that have ideas or things that are problematic, let us know, because the vast majority of our legislative agenda items come from our members of expressing things that are problematic, and that's the things that we start working on. So we're available to all of you.
I do appreciate it. Well, in closing, I want to thank all of you for joining us. We're going to have another great podcast in September, so please join us. But most important, Lee, thank you very much. He is our voice in Austin. He's a dear friend of ours, and we really appreciate your time, Lee. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Always happy to be with you.
You bet.